A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're going to turn our attention today to the crisis that is confronting Western civilization. Our special guest today says, whenever Christianity is abandoned, tyranny follows. Close to home, because Australia is a Western nation, and perhaps equally vulnerable to the consequences of moving away from our Judeo-Christian roots. What are those vulnerabilities? You might like to contribute to what you think the vulnerabilities might even be today. You know, things like our social cohesion, the deep divisions at so many different levels, threats of wars and invasion, and what about mass migration or the ingrained weaknesses in political leadership when there's no alignment with that Judeo-Christian foundation? Well, our special guest today is about to address the Church and State Summit this weekend in Brisbane. He's sounding an alarm that our civilization is not just declining, but is being dismantled. George Christensen is going to be our guest over this next hour. He served 3 terms in the Australian Parliament with the LNP. He's been Australian Campaigns Director for Citizen Go, major organisation that draws attention to some major issues confronting the world. He was the founder of Nation First, and he's made a return to local government when he was elected councillor of the Mackay Regional Council last year. George Christensen, a special welcome back to 2020.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. It's always great to be on your wonderful show.
Hey, just before we get into all the details around what we'll talk about today, George, southeast Queensland and northeast New South Wales confronted with a cyclone threat. You're in North Queensland. This is, it's almost regular for where you are. You're based in Mackay, but anywhere north of Mackay, you just know cyclones. They're just normal part of life. But I wonder if you've got any words of encouragement for those who are in southeast Queensland and perhaps northern New South Wales.
And we call this section between Mackay and Townsville Cyclone Alley because we get quite a few, but it's very much a turn up for the books to see one heading towards Brisbane and even northern New South Wales. So it's quite unusual. But look, follow all the preparations. That's all I have to say. Sometimes in North Queensland, because, of what I said, we get a bit complacent. I mean, Neil, off air, I was sort of having a joke with you about a cyclone that passed over Bowen, and I was stuck in a motel room for the night, one of those dodgy little motel rooms, and I sat on all I could do is just sit on the veranda and watch the storm pass by. Now, that's probably not what you do, but sometimes these things aren't as big as what the media make out to be. That is one of my criticisms of cyclones, Neil, that sometimes there's a little bit of over-exaggeration, but nonetheless, prepare. Do what the authorities say to do, and you will be safe.
And I guess, in defence of what the media does when it comes to these things, and yes, of course, fear-mongering is one of those things that you've always got to be very cautious and sensitive to, but the media does have to report the worst-case scenario. And
Correct.
Sometimes that worst-case scenario does come to pass, and when it doesn't, we're all thankful that it doesn't, and things were not quite as bad. But yes, certainly mindful of those listeners in southeast Queensland, northeast New South Wales, those who are likely to be impacted by Cyclone Alfred. Let's not have a cyclone conversation because there's a big issue that we had planned to talk about, and that is Western civilization. You're saying it's at threat. Some will say, historians try to reconstruct the past, and it often looks rosy. You've got science fiction writers or prophets who might be trying to imagine the future. Some think that the past is outdated here, but that's the only thing that really gives us the opportunity to glean the sort of values that are going to help us see through into the future. What are your thoughts around a world history and how we might be contextualised in our moment here?
That's an interesting thought. And I guess first I've got to say that all this is predicated on the fact that this Friday and Saturday, the Church and State Summit is happening in Brisbane. It's a Christian culture conference for people wanting to redeem the culture and say what God says about debated issues, and that's happening at the Brisbane Airport Conference Centre. So not the one inside the middle of Brisbane, the Brisbane Airport Conference Centre. So it should be a good conference with a lot of people, good people lined up, including yours truly. But my speech, as you've alluded to, Neil, is all about the fact the West is in its final hour. And what I'm positing is that's not because of natural decline, but because it's being actively dismantled. And you asked, how are they going to look upon the era? And I think that if there is a lens of truth cast upon our current era, that it will be that. We are in a period of not just political and cultural decay, but I'm going to say a spiritual crisis as well. We've got churches empty, Christian values mocked, our leaders, both secular and religious, they've practically surrendered. But I'm going to say the speech is not just doom and gloom. It's not just an analysis. It's a call to action. It's a demand that Christian people rise up to defend faith, family, and our civilization.
When you're sounding the alarm bells, you've got to be able to focus on those things that are in decay or in decline or being this time dismantled before you can actually bring a message of hope into there. And we often will think that the message of hope is the thing that we want to start with, but you've got to be able to start with those things that are in decay and the rejection or just moving away from those values that have shaped Western culture. This is the starting point because Western culture built on our Judeo-Christian foundation. That's the thing that's in decay right now. Thoughts here?
And of course, in any case, you've got to put forward what the problem is, because if people don't even realise there's a problem, there is no way that there is going to become a solution. So, and I think that the problem is evident. Your listeners and yourself, your good self, would know we've got a problem. We've got a civilization that's practically abandoned its soul. The West was at one time called Christendom. It was built on Christian foundations, from the laws that we've got to the universities, from its culture to its scientific achievements. It was all based around Christianity. And those foundations have been and are being ripped apart. Faith, as I said, has been abandoned. Morality's not just been abandoned, it's been redefined. Now everything's turned on its head. Good is evil, evil is good. Christian voices now are being silenced. We're in this period of culture that's not just post-Christian, it's morphed into anti-Christian. But the crisis isn't new, Neil. History shows that every civilization that actually rejects God falls into this sort of semblance of tyranny. The French Revolution, the Soviet Union, Communist China, they all turned against Christianity. And in every case, oppression followed. So what I'm positing is that the new isms of the day, globalism, secularism, progressivism, they're not actually progress, that they are weapons that are being used against the Christian West, and that sadly will be used against the Christian people as well.
Always appreciate your studies too in theology, and not everyone appreciates that someone who's served in our national parliament might actually have some level of understanding about theological things. But back to the Old Testament, where the people of Israel, when they had let go of the values, let go of God's law, there were prophets who were raised up to sound the alarm bell. Sometimes the people listened to the word of the prophet and they were saved as a nation. Other times they rejected the prophets and things went downhill from there. The prophetic voice today, I wonder if you've got a thought here, because, when we reflect on the Old Testament prophet and what a New Testament prophet might look like, and maybe we might not put labels on individuals, but perhaps the Christian church has a prophetic voice into the current situation. What's your appreciation of how we might think of Old Testament prophets sounding alarm bells?
Well, that's interesting now, because the speech that I'm giving does refer to one of those, to two of those Old Testament prophets, and very, very particularly, and it's a message for people of today about that ministry. I think that needs to be rekindled very much, not just by the church, but by Christians themselves, everyday Christians, to be prophets. Prophets aren't people who are crystal ball gazing or, have the power of seeing into the future. they are people, as you rightly say, that are ringing the alarm bell on behalf of God, on behalf of all that is good. And one of those prophets was Elijah, and there was his disciple Elisha. And there's the sort of famous sort of in almost incredulous sort of ending to Elijah's earthly ministry, where he is sort of swept up on this chariot and disappears, and his mantle, is on the ground. And I think this is in 2 Kings, where Elijah takes up the mantle, wraps it together, and then he smites the waters, and they're divided. And so it's like this moment where the prophetic ministry is passed from the master, Elijah, to the disciple, Elisha. And this is where we get that saying, to pick up your mantle, to take up your mantle. The mantle now lies at our feet. The great men of Christendom, the martyrs, the saints, the warriors, they are gone. They are gone. And who is there to pick it up? Well, it's us. We are the ones that have got to rebuild Christian families. We're the ones that have got to defend Christian nations. We're the ones that have got to restore Christian culture. So it all lies with us. And that prophetic ministry being rekindled is very, very important. We are called not just to be prophets, but to be leaders, protectors, dare I say, warriors, not in the violent sense, but in the sense that you have to have a heart for spiritual warfare these days, I believe.
A biblical perspective on life, culture, and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
And our talkback line is open, 1800 316 316. To join in our conversation, our special guest is George Christensen, and he's just getting ready to address the Church and State Summit this weekend in Brisbane. Perhaps there's still a seat or two available there. And you can just simply Google Church and State Summit to find out how you could be a part of that. It's on this weekend, on Friday and on Saturday. Hey, George, we're talking about Old Testament prophets. Elijah, Elisha. Of course, Elisha was the successor to Elijah, and it's almost as though there was a spiritual transfer of authority that happened in that moment. I wonder if there's any parallel we can think of today, because, maybe we haven't had as many Elijahs around to pass on authority to Elishas. What are your thoughts here on that sort of succession and the responsibility?
You're probably right with that. With that assessment. I mean, that's not to say that there are no prophetic voices in the church today. There are plenty, but they're probably in the minority now. The church should be leading the fight for the restoration in culture. But I've got to say that many of the church leaders, particularly in mainline churches, I believe are actually opening the gates to the enemy. They've accepted anti-Christian ideologies. They've watered down their own doctrine, and they're fearing the labels of the world more than they are fearing the judgment of God. And that is a very, very big problem. That is the greatest crisis that we face. It's not, as I said, political or cultural, it's spiritual. And so we need to go back to even just the great prophets of our time. I mean, think of people like Billy Graham. I mean, I would put Billy Graham down in the style of a prophet. He was also an evangelist. Men in Catholicism, you got men like Fulton Sheen, who was a great Catholic evangelist as well. But even in, away from clergymen, I got to say, look to people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who I got to say was another one of those great Christian prophets of the 20th century. So if the prophets are largely gone from the church, and I'm not saying they're completely gone, still some there today, but perhaps it behoves us to pick up a book, or if you must, download it onto your Kindle or whatever device you might have, and read what these great prophets had to say that are in our living era, I guess. And are we able to glean anything from that to take up the mantle and continue on? And taking up the mantle means that we then need to act, and I think that the way to restoration of culture is, doing and also evangelizing to others, about raising strong families, reclaiming the pulpit, encouraging fearless pastors to preach the gospel without compromise. I'm going to say that's one of the things that the Church and State Summit is doing for the first time this year. They're actually getting pastors in to have other pastors talk to them about that, reclaiming the pulpit. But, it's more than that. It's about defending our nations, rejecting globalist tyranny, standing for Christian law and order, resisting anything that dilutes Christian culture. And controversially, I'm going to be saying that includes mass, particularly unregulated immigration. And as I said before, we need to reclaim the warrior spirit. And I don't mean in a violent sense, but we've got so many Christian resistance movements in history that actually show, they prove that God blesses those who stand for him.
You mentioned Billy Graham in a light that some listeners might be surprised by because, as you say, he's known as a great evangelist. He's not known as a great prophet, and yet he had the ear of successive presidents of the United States, generation after generation of those presidents. And if we're looking for the sorts of things that might characterise a prophet, it is that they are going to speak to power. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that in Australia, perhaps power is not listening, but there needs to be more of that ability to speak to power. And I've got to say, this is what I guess the Church and State Summit has been about now for many, many years, equipping leaders to speak to power. What are your thoughts here around the thought that power needs to be able to hear the voice of the prophetic leader?
110%. And that's what we've got to do at the moment, speak to culture. And it's all the instruments of culture. And, Billy Graham, he did that. He had the ear of presidents. In fact, I think one of the great biographies that I read about Billy Graham was called The Prophet with Honour, something like that, or A Prophet with Honour. So he was, known by some at least as a prophet as well for his ability to speak faith and speak words of wisdom and speak the things of God to the culture and to those in power. And I think that that's one of the things that needs to be taken up today. The church has remained silent on a whole heap of different issues that some of them, quite frankly, that are core issues to Christianity. Abortion. I mean, I don't know about you, but when was the last time that you heard a sermon in your church about abortion? Perhaps you go to a better church than I might go to, Neil. You might have heard one, but I'm going to say for many Christians, it's probably few and far between.
Perhaps it is, and there might be listeners who want to comment on that as well. 1-800-316-316 to join into our conversation. When we talk about a Church and State Summit, it's on this weekend. It's on Friday and on Saturday. The thought of passing on a mantle, and this is what you're going to be delivering, and you're, maybe one of the many voices who are going to be there and passing on some values as to how people can be an influence in their own communities and in the nation. I can't help get over, though, when we're talking, and this I think it's an important analogy here, Elijah passing on this mantle to Elisha. You almost have to arrive at this Church and State Summit with an Elisha type of mindset to receive something from those Christian leaders, church and political, who are looking to pass on their impression and their values to a hopefully eager audience there. But have an Elisha mindset, because remember this, and I'll get your thoughts, Elisha was expectant and received, what the Bible tells us, was a double portion of that prophetic power. Any thoughts here for what could happen this weekend?
Well, you're right. We hope that everyone turning up to this conference has that Elisha spirit or the Elisha mindset, because, that's what it's all about. This is about discipling people, and hopefully if we disciple people to be prophets, evangelists, crusaders for the future of our culture, and particularly, wanting to reclaim the culture for Christianity, then we have done our job as a conference. That is what the Church and State Conference is all about. And I think that at this time, it's really important, Neil, really important, because the attack on Christian culture isn't random. It's a deliberate effort to erase Christian identity from all walks of life. And I'm going to say that I'll be positing that mass migration, historical revisionism, woke ideology, they are all tools designed to weaken Christian culture, to weaken Christian nations, and to weaken Christians themselves. History shows that no civilization survives when it forgets its faith, right? When it forgets its identity. The Romans, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, even outside of Christianity, the Ottomans, the Muslim Empire, they all fell when they actually abandoned their own culture and opened their gates to outsiders. And we haven't just opened it to outsiders, we've opened it to outside influences, to influences that are anti-Christian. And so the battle is here. The war is now. I'm not talking in a violent sense, but in a rhetorical sense. And we've got to stand firm in Christ, or we're just going to fade into history. The whole idea of Christian culture will fade into history.
George, let's take a call. Adam is in Marysville in Victoria. Adam, welcome along. What are your thoughts about our conversation today?
Well, I'd just like to comment on. I believe one of the reasons why, two of the reasons why that the church in the West is in decline is because there is a sector of the church, or denominations even, that are teaching Cesanism, and that is the gifts of the Holy Spirit is no longer applies to us today. And you mentioned prophets, and the other one would be syncretism, and that's because of multiculturalism. You got these other cultures like Hinduism. And some of our churches have even taken on some of these practices like yoga, and which comes from Hinduism. And the Bible's clear on not mixing Christianity with
Adam, you're making some good points here, and I'll get George's impression in just a moment, but when you mention cessationism, this thought that, miracles don't happen anymore, and, the prophetic word doesn't come. Those sorts of things come along with cessationism. My argument would be that cessationism comes along with a secularizing of the church. So, when we think about those things, the syncretism too, the interconnecting of different religious faiths. But what are your thoughts here, George Christensen, for Adam?
Spot on, Adam. Spot on. Cessationism, it's one of those things we don't talk about, but you hit the nail right on the head, Neil. That is just simply the church that is trying to abide by what modern sensibilities are, and it's casting off the supernatural. I'm not sure if that's the right word to use here, but the supernatural element of Christianity. The element that's outside of the normal laws of nature, but it's like that because the Creator is outside those normal laws of nature. He is the one who developed nature itself, so with him anything that can happen. So I firmly believe in miracles. I firmly believe in the gift of prophecy, in spiritual warfare. There aren't things that the Christian church should hide because it offends the sensibilities of some. I mean, what you're talking about there when you have that at the nth degree is like what Thomas Jefferson, I think it was, bless his soul, actually did. He got the Bible and he rewrote it. Well, he edited it. And what he did is he got the New Testament and he cut out every single act in it that he believed was supernatural, so that what he was just left with was an acceptable to him gospel that was just Jesus' teaching. So that would be the Christianity you end up with. He was a good teacher. He wasn't God. He didn't perform any miracles. He didn't come back from the dead. Well, what is that? What is that? That's what people describe, like Rod Dreher, as Christianity being devolved into moral therapeutic deism, where we believe in a God, we're not sure what he's about, but hey, come to church and you can fix all your life problems and feel good about yourself. That's not the Christianity that I believe in. That's not the Christianity of tradition.
Adam, anything further to add?
Yeah, well, I definitely don't. I 100% agree with you. I definitely agree in the supernatural and the miracles and I happen to go to a church that definitely teaches the gifts of the Holy Spirit and even allows us to explore what gifts might we have, like prophetic gifts or healing and yeah. I was just wondering if you had any comment on the syncretism too in some churches.
Okay, the syncretism, the idea that you might mix your Christianity with a little bit of Hinduism and Buddhism. And, I think you mentioned yoga in church and those sorts of things. That's very contentious in some circles. Did you have a thought on that at all, George?
Oh, sure. It's what I'm saying. We've got outside forces that are destroying the West, but because they've been embraced by some, it's almost betrayal from within, and we can look to Christian leaders for that and church leaders for that, who are bowing before the world, preaching compromise instead of conviction. And I get what you're saying. We've got elements of other cultures, other faiths even, that are coming in to Christianity, and they're polluting it, they're corrupting it. And as a result, the pulpit, which should be a place of fire and truth, it's grown cold. It's grown dead. The church should be leading the fight, but we've got many leaders who have either opened the gates to the enemy, or they are opening the gates to the enemy with anti-Christian ideologies, watered down doctrine, polluted doctrine because of other faiths that have come into the mix. And all that happens, I believe, not because church leaders that are doing this are bad or evil or whatever, but because they want to conform to the times. They fear the labels of the world more than they fear the judgment of God. And that is a very, very big problem.
Adam in Marysville in Victoria, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1-800 316 316. You can join in our conversation. We're talking about a dismantling of our Western civilizational roots, those foundations, the Judeo-Christian perspective, and even talking here about the thoughts of cessationism and what that looks like, because, of course, the Bible is full of so much of the miraculous, the supernatural, which I think was the right words to be using there, George. But if we're talking supernatural, some might be saying, well, there are lots of different dimensions to the supernatural. Is there some sort of sinister plot? Is there an evil puppeteer? Is there, the devil meddling in what we do? Because sometimes we're afraid to talk about the fact that there could be some sinister plot that might go beyond our human understanding. What are your thoughts here?
I think that if we truly believe what the Bible tells us, then the answer's got to be yes. There is someone. We call him Satan, the devil, the deceiver, the liar. He is the enemy of God, and he is working his way through the things of the world. And that's what we are up again. We don't just fight against, flesh and bones alone. It's the powers and principalities, Neil. It's all laid out there. So spiritual warfare is real. We are fighting against an enemy, and he is working his way either consciously, and that's disturbing to think about if you do think about that for a second, either consciously or unconsciously through people, his agents in the world. I firmly believe that.
No, we won't get on a tangent here, but when we talk about evil puppeteers, might be talking spiritually, might be talking, and I know you've got a lot to say about people at the World Economic Forum and the rise of cultural Marxism. Maybe save something for that. You never know where some listeners might take us. 1-800 316 316 to join in our conversation. Dee is in Tasmania. Hey, Dee, welcome.
Hello, Neil. Thank you. Yes, I just had a comment. In my line I work in mental health, and one of the things I noticed that comes with deconstruction of the West is a lot of harm, and that, and trauma. If we have for example, a hypersexualized culture, that means a lot of abuse. If we have a deconstruction of values, it means an increase in anxiety and all sorts of mental health issues, a pandemic, really. And I wonder about Christians engaging with that. And I think that, when we care about the culture wars, we can forget to really listen, because it's in listening that we find the entry points into that pain where we can start to have conversations with people we might otherwise feel threatened by. Have you noticed that, George, that there's a sense of feeling threatened by people who are not Christian? And sometimes when that happens, we don't engage very well with their pain, and we forget to hear them in trying to speak our truth to them.
George, your thoughts for Dee?
It's deep. That's very deep, Dee. That's and I would agree with what you're saying. It's the old story that God gave us two ears and one mouth, and we should use them in that order. And listening to the plight of other people is very important. And I think, I keep on saying it because you're all right. You've hit the nail on the head again. The fact is that this rupture in our culture, in our civilization, has caused so much pain, and it continues to cause so much pain, real pain for people, for families, and we're seeing that bear out. I mean, look at the suicide rates, look at the divorce rates, look at all of these factors that have just blown up in the last, what would you say, 50, 60, 70 years. I mean, this is not by accident. I believe it's by design. And yes, you can only... We talk about abstract things, or I talk about abstract things like the culture, right? But at the end of the day, it comes down to people, to individual people. And only by sitting down and listening to them, finding their point of pain and talking to them about that, and about the only hope for restoration for that pain. And we know what that is. That's a man who's also God. His name is Jesus Christ. And that is the only hope for restoration for their pain. That needs to be something that we instill individually in that person, but also at a macro level in the culture as well. So I agree with what you've said, Dee.
Dee, anything further to add?
No, I think, perhaps, thank you so much for those comments. I have a lot of hope. I work in a lot of chaos, and I hear horrible stories, working in mental health. But it gives me a lot of hope, because people are in so much pain. And we, Christians, are really the people who can minister to that, but we've got to deeply listen.
Dee, thank you so much for your call, and our talkback line remains open on 1800 316 316 if you'd like to join in our conversation. It's interesting that Dee raises something so important here for us to understand, because we wonder oftentimes, George, about the power of that Judeo-Christian foundation to shape a culture, and Dee draws attention to the fact that we're in a hypersexualized culture. But the outcomes that we're seeing from that are abuse and, as Dee says, trauma. When we actually make the comparison to what the Judeo-Christian foundation would be marriage between a man and a woman, and the raising of children according to some values that will help them to actually go on to be effective as parents and as citizens in a society that might be, in some ways, you might describe it as harmonious. The effects that we're seeing from the dismantling do have a way of reversing, but you have to change your thinking. Any thoughts here from you?
Yeah, and this is a tough one, this one that you've just brought up, because, I mean, our whole culture is hypersexualized. You can't go out, you can't turn on the TV, you can't, apart from vision, you can't turn on the radio without hearing this hypersexualized culture in action. It is very, very disturbing, and how we protect our children from that is a good question that many parents are asking right now. And if they have the solutions, come and tell me. I'm keen to hear them. But we tread in this civilization, in this culture, which is hypersexualized. All we can do is, where we're aware that it is, turn off, and try and speak to our own families in particular, our own children in particular, about what you said before, Neil. Why are we here? Why do we have the gift of sexuality itself? Well, it's for marriage, it's for procreation, it's for children, it's for love ultimately, and it's a mimicry of the love of God in one respects, and that's deep. I don't want to get into a theology of love and marital sexuality, but it is, and the bond between husband and wife is so important for children, because it actually affects their worldview on everything. But anyway, we're getting into another area there, Neil.
All right. Well, let's, to encapsulate one of those things, and I've said this, long-time listeners will know I say this. One of the things that has been so powerful that Christianity has been able to bring to a prosperous culture and foundations for Western civilization, you might even add there, is this capacity to be able to harness sexuality into the marriage between a man and a woman, so that prosperity comes, because as she's committed to him and he's committed to her, together they're committed to their children. And so they make a life for their children. What do they do to make a life? They become prosperous in building whatever enterprise that actually builds their family. So you've got,
and they sacrifice, Neil. They sacrifice to become prosperous, and that sacrificial love is a thing of God. Yes,
there's so many dimensions there where we can actually draw attention to that. So if you're talking about an unbridled sexuality, divorce comes from that, and of course weakened family structures. So if you want to strengthen the family somehow or other, I'm not sure if there are other alternatives, but the one that I certainly promote and talk about, and we do on this program, is that marriage is important between a man and a woman, and it is a lifelong commitment. Hey, let's just broaden this. We're not going to get through a whole lot of things. There's so much we could talk about, George. But if we're talking about some of these things that are, that are in decay right now, and what you might see, the rise of corruption, I think that's becoming more rife. You just think of your own workplace and the sorts of dealings that you have, the scams that are out there, the thought of stealing. I mean, that's one of the commandments, isn't it? Thou shalt not steal. There's something in there that private ownership becomes very important. So for the flourishing of a culture, we want the courts to be able to defend our capacity to own things. But even our courts are coming under question. Thoughts here about other areas, George, whether it's corruption or stealing or adultery or the false witness idea. Some of these things have such powerful ramifications for an entire society. Any thoughts from you?
Yeah, well, let's talk about corruption and the theft element that you brought in there. Of course, Christian laws, the laws of our land have a Christian foundation. But if you are trying to uncouple society from its Christian foundation, then eventually those laws are going to stray. And so there we see the rise of political leaders, politicians that are corrupt. I mean, that's one level. We've always had that to a degree, but if you have no values, no basis in your belief system, then it becomes that mantra of anything goes. The ends justifies the means, and I think that's where corruption can slip in. But when we talk about the law itself, I mean, yes, thou shalt not steal, one of the 10 commandments, one of those foundational things of Christianity, and you do not covet thy neighbour's goods. And those two things go together quite well. But the problem is that even today, we covet our neighbour's goods. And so the law changes because of that human desire that grows and grows. And so we see the erosion of property rights. And we have seen that on many an occasion. I can point out many different examples of the erosion of property rights. So this is a problem, and I think that's where it does stem from. It all stems from this we are being unshackled. I shouldn't say shackled because that sounds like a bad term, but we're being uncoupled from our Christian mooring.
Let's end our conversation coming back to something you shared just a little earlier when we were talking about the Old Testament prophets, Elijah, who put his coat, his cloak, his mantle onto the shoulders of his successor, Elisha. And knowing that you're going to be speaking at the Church and State Summit this weekend, and the theme there is Pulpits Aflame with Righteousness, I wonder if you've got a quick, just concluding comment or two, because it's going to be an important way of delivering that sort of idea of passing on a mantle to those who will be there at the summit. Any thoughts, George?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts which are positive. History shows us that revival's possible now. When nations turn back to God, when people turn back to God, he restores them. God never abandons his people. He always preserves at least a faithful remnant. But I've got to say that it begins with us. Revival doesn't come from weakness. It comes from boldness. It comes from conviction. It comes from action. And so we've got to raise our voices, pick up our mantle, stand together as warriors for Christ and Christianity, because now is not the time for passive Christianity in an anti-Christian culture. It's a moment for warriors. If we do nothing, our children are going to live in a world, that sexualized world we talked about, where Christianity is actually criminalized, where churches are in ruins either physically or metaphorically. But if we stand, if we fight, if we remain faithful, then Christian culture can rise again, and we will be strong again.
Wonderful insights today from you, George, and I sincerely say, not all media reports on George Christensen in a favourable light, but when you speak to us, the common sense that is there and that foundation of spirituality, very, very powerful. And I want to say my appreciation to you for being able to reflect these things today as you're going to boldly proclaim at the Church and State Summit this weekend. Now, for listeners thinking the Church and State Summit, well, it's on this Friday and Saturday, 7th and 8th of March at the Brisbane Airport Conference Centre, the Brisbane Airport Conference Centre. There is a website, churchandstate.com.au, and as I understand it, there's still some seats available this year, a bigger venue and the opportunity for more people to attend the Church and State Summit. It'll be powerful. The theme is Pulpits Aflame with Righteousness. And to connect with George and some of the issues that he's often talking about, citizengo.org is another website where you can subscribe and get some online petitions and action alerts as a resource to defend and promote life, family and liberty, citizengo.org. And George, is there any other connection points? People can follow you on social media?
They certainly can. I'm all over the shop, and also my newsletter, nationfirst.substack.com. nationfirst.substack.com. George Christensen, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us today on 2020. Always a pleasure, Neil. Thank you very much.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.